Several of Turner's works were engraved in the Literary Souvenir, the Keepsake, the Picturesque Annual, and Turner's Tour of the Seine and the Loire. It has been the fashion of late to decry the class of publications known under the designation of annuals, once so popular, and to place them all, good, bad, and indifferent, in the same category. Yet the services which they rendered to art and literature, with the details of their history placed fairly before the public, would go far to arrest this unjust tone of depreciation. The painter's reputation with the public at large was no doubt greatly extended by the 2 or 3 works of this class to which he contributed. They penetrated where large prints had never before found their way. Of Mr. Turner's repugnance to part with money, many amusing instances are on record. After volunteering to erect a monument over the remains of his early companion, Girton, who lies in the churchyard of St. Paul, Covent Garden, he retracted on finding that it would cost rather more than £10. But had he been asked to contribute a picture for this object worth 10 times the sum, he would no doubt have given it freely. Thus, the father of the late hall porter of Mr. Walter Fawkes, of Farnley Hall, Yorkshire, who kept the village alehouse, received from him a drawing of great value in liquidation of a trifling score of some £4 or £5. The manner in which this transaction was discovered is curious enough. On retiring from Mr. Fawkes's service to replace his father as host to the village house of entertainment, the man was desirous of purchasing the old hall chair in which he had been accustomed to sit for many years, and having been allowed to appraise it himself at £4, offered instead of hard cash a capital drawing by Turner, which had been given to his father in acquittance of his bill. One of his best sea pieces is said to have been transferred to a Margate boatman under nearly similar circumstances. Let it never be forgotten, however, that whilst he was displaying a parsimony utterly inconsistent with his acknowledged pecuniary means and his position in society, he was laying up store to enable him to carry out that noble scheme of benevolence which reflects so much honor on his memory. He purchased a plot of land at Twickenham, many years before his death, for the institution he proposed to found for the benefit of decayed painters, and the property destined to provide for this grand scheme of benevolence has, thanks to his self-denying habits, increased so largely that he is believed to have left behind him upwards of £100,000 devoted to this object. His property has been sworn under £140,000, but it is likely to prove much larger, and should it escape the depleting effects of a chancery suit, taxes, will afford abundant funds for the realization of his long-cherished project. Unfortunately, to save a little expense, Mr. Turner was his own will maker, and as a very natural consequence, his intentions are so obscurely indicated that no one but the Lord Chancellor seems likely to unravel them. It contains several conflicting codicils written at considerable intervals, and is in some respects irregular and informal. We have been assured, however, that its oversights and contradictions are not of a kind to prove fatal to the wishes of the testator. In 1807, Turner was appointed Professor of Perspective in the Royal Academy, and no painter could have been selected for the office whose works bore testimony to a more perfect practical knowledge of the subject. He had displayed the power of aerial perspective on his canvas with a degree of truth almost magical. He could exhibit in his pictures any extent of distance accessible to the naked eye, but unhappily he had not acquired the art of conveying his knowledge in any other way than by his pencil. The defects of his early education rendered the difficulty of orally expounding his principles insurmountable, and after a short time he appears to have abandoned the attempt. Although he retained the office of Professor of Perspective until 1837, nearly 30 years, he lectured only during 2 or 3, which caused some dissatisfaction. The various stories which are intended to illustrate the exclusiveness of our great painter in making a strict secret of any discoveries he may have made in the preparation or application of his colors, or the legerdemain by which he produced certain effects of light and shade, which really seemed to have been called into question, into existence, by enchantment. Now let me start that sentence again. The various stories which are intended to illustrate the exclusiveness of our great painter in making a strict secret of any discoveries he may have made in the preparation or application of his colors, or the legerdemain by which he produced certain effects of light and shade, which really seem to have been called into existence by enchantment, are in a great degree disproved by facts that are within the personal knowledge of all his contemporaries of the Royal Academy. A portion of each of his exhibited pictures is known to have been painted on the days appointed for retouching and varnishing, and on such occasions his brother artists had abundant opportunities of acquainting themselves with the secrets of his practical operation. He could not, at such times at least, have concealed the character of his colors on his palette or his mode of applying them. In 1808, Mr. Turner added a country house at the end of the Upper Mall, Hammersmith, to his town residence. In 1812, he removed from Harley Street to 47 Queen Anne Street West. 2 years afterwards, he left Hammersmith for a villa at Twickenham, which he first called Solace Lodge, but soon altered to the more euphonious designation of Sandycombe Lodge. Of this villa, an engraving by the elder Cook was published in 1814 in his Thames Scenery from a sketch by Havel. Turner seldom visited Twickenham after 1826, when he sold Sandycombe to Mr. Todd, but that he retained his affections for it is evident by his will, which directs his proposed houses for decayed artists to be built in this beautiful locality. He retained his residence in Queen Anne Street until the day of his death. It is situated on the south side of the street and has for many years past borne all the exterior signs of a house in Chancery. It seems doubtful if its windows have been cleaned or its doors painted for more than 20 years. Such was the monomania of the painter that he permitted much of the valuable property it contained to be irreparably injured and some to be altogether destroyed, rather than incur the expense of an occasional fire. An old porter and Such was the monomania of the painter that he permitted much of the valuable property it contained to be irreparably injured and some to be altogether destroyed, rather than incur the expense of an occasional fire. An old porter and an older female domestic who had been in the service of his father and whose habits were almost as economical as those of their master were the sole occupants of the house during the long absences of the painter. Mr. Turner's conduct to his father has been much misrepresented. Mr. Turner's conduct to his father has been much misrepresented. No sooner had the son achieved the honors of the Academy than he shut up the shop in Maiden Lane and took the old man to his own home, where he treated him invariably with kindness and respect. Anecdotes have been long current of the elder Turner having acted as porter to his son and received the gratuities of visitors, and we have even heard artists affirm that they have often dropped a shilling into his extended palm within the last 20 years. Such stories are wholly destitute of foundation and must have originated in misconception, as the elder Turner died in 1830 and never, we have reason to believe, acted in the capacity here referred to. But as the old man was quite as economical as his son, he would always, when possible, spare the outlay of a shilling by fetching and carrying parcels, especially books. During the 49 years that Mr. Turner was a member of the Royal Academy, he was absent only on 4 occasions from its walls, namely in 1815, 1821, 1824, and 1851. The prices of his pictures during a large portion of the best period of his career were exceedingly moderate. Up to 1815, they ranged from 100 to 300 guineas. Lord de Tabley paid him the last mentioned for The Wreck, engraved by Charles Turner, but the commercial value of that picture now exceeds 4 times that sum. For his drawings for the England and Wales, he received at so late a date in 1825 only 25 guineas and 30 proofs. Yet these drawings have since fetched prices varying from 80 to 150 guineas each. Flint Castle, for example, was lately sold by Messrs. Christie and Manson by public auction for £125. For his small book vignettes, he received from 12 to 20 guineas. His reluctance to part with his pictures is notorious. It was next to impossible for publishers to purchase from him direct any of his important works. In 1825, the writer accompanied the late Mr. J.O. Robinson of the firm of Hearst, Robinson and Company to his house by appointment to look at a picture which had been recommended by Mr. John Pye for engraving as a companion to the Temple of Jupiter, purchased by that firm for 500 guineas and splendidly engraved by Mr. Pye. But, although 750 guineas was the sum Mr. Turner had himself named for this picture, his Carthage, only a few days before, he had in the interim increased his demand to 1,000 guineas. Mr. Robinson objected that he could not consent to so large an increase of price without obtaining the sanction of his partners. But before they had time to make up their minds, Mr. Turner sent them a verbal message declining to dispose of it at all. He considered it, he said, his chef d'oeuvre, his masterpiece. Lord God, what time is it?
4:04.
Okay, I think that's enough for now. The late Mr. Duroveray, whose embellished editions of popular British classics exercised a beneficial influence on the public taste and led to a manifest improvement in book illustrations, showed the writer more than 20 years ago a very early drawing, either a copy or an imitation of Paul Sandby, signed W. Turner, which had been given to him by a friend who had purchased it from the hairdresser's window. He also stated on the same authority that the cellar under the shop was inhabited by the family, and that drawings of a similar character were hung around the entrance, ticketed at prices varying from 1 shilling to 3. Many years ago, Mr. Tom Kaizen, the eminent pianoforte manufacturer, related to us the following anecdote, published with some variation by Monsieur Peter Cunningham, but as no date was mentioned, we are unable to state whether the occurrence preceded or followed the exposition of the boy's drawings for sale. With the view, in all probability, of drawing the attention of his customer to young Turner's dexterity with his pencil, the father, who was in daily attendance on the elder Mr. Tom Kaizen, a zealous encourager of the fine arts, availed himself on one occasion of the opportunity to take the young painter along with him, leaving him to his own devices whilst the operations of shaving, curling, and powdering were going on. During this interval, the boy was not idle, but attracted by the vivid colors of an emblazoned coat of arms, which was hanging in the room, took out his pencil and a sheet of paper, and in a very short time completed an exact copy of it, including a lion rampant and sundry emblematical decorations. The dexterity of the boy and the correctness of the outline attracted at once the attention of Mr. Tom Kaizen and interested him warmly in his behalf. From this date, both Mr. Tom Kaizen and his son, the latter still living, hale and active, in his 89th year, aided the views of the young artist by every means in their power. That this sport of a few leisure moments was not Turner's first attempt in the art of design must be conceded at once, for Mr. Tom Kaizen remembers having seen, a very short time afterwards, several drawings from the pencil of the young artist exposed for the sale in his father's shop window. Confirmed by the opinion of his much respected customer, the elder Turner determined to make his son an artist and seemed to feel an honorable pride in proclaiming his intentions. When asked by Mr. Stothard that William was to be answered in the joy of his heart, when asked by Mr. Stothard what William was to be, he answered in the joy of his heart, "William is going to be a painter." From this time, young Turner applied himself with utmost assiduity to the practice of his art, and having, by the sale of his sketches and the assistance of his father, been provided with sufficient means, he forthwith repaired to the greatest of all teachers, and sketched in the fields and by the waysides from nature herself. His early drawings had been confined to the pencil, or at most Indian ink, but he now began to make rapid progress in the use of colors, and soon became so skillful in this branch of art that whilst yet a boy, he managed to procure employment from Mr. Raphael Smith, a mezzotint engraver and portrait painter of considerable reputation in the immediate neighborhood. Here he formed an intimacy with Girton, the founder of the English school of watercolor painting, who was engaged like himself to color prints on Mr. Smith's establishment. There can be no doubt that Turner's acquaintance with that clever and truthful watercolor painter exercised a most beneficial influence on his pencil. The style of young Girton exhibited a manifest improvement on the hard and bald accuracy of Paul Sandby and his followers, and had he lived, he might have proved a formidable rival to his friend, whose senior he was by about 2 years. Unhappily, however, for the interests of art, he died in 1802, not, as has been represented, from an illness engendered by dissipated habits, but of an asthmatical complaint which had its origin in a cold caught while sketching. His son, Mr. Calvert Girton, describes his father and young Turner as associated in a friendly rivalry under the hospitable roof and superintendence of that lover of art, Dr. Monroe, then residing in the Adelphi. Nor was Turner forgetful of the doctor's kindness, for in referring to that period of his career in a conversation with Mr. David Roberts, He said, "There," pointing to Harrow, "Girton and I have often walked to Busby and back to make drawings for good Dr. Munro at half a crown a piece and a supper." Girton had received the benefit of a more regular education than Turner, having been a pupil of Day's and a student of the Royal Academy for nearly 3 years. He had also the advantage of having accompanied one of his early patrons in repeated tours among the most picturesque scenery of England, Scotland, and Wales, at a time when Turner's means afforded him no opportunity of sketching from nature beyond the outskirts of the metropolis. Girton was the first to introduce the custom of drawing upon cartridge paper, thus avoiding the glare common to a smooth white surface. Many of Turner's early drawings were made on paper of this description, and some of the finest of his later designs, although of magical effect, were executed on coarse blue paper. If imitation be indeed, as we are assured it is, the sincerest flattery, there can be little doubt of the very high opinion entertained by Girton by Turner, for we have seen one of his drawings of this time that might almost be mistaken for the work of his friend. Girton's breadth of handling and knowledge of light and shade, and his acquaintance with aerial perspective would seem not to have been lost on Turner. Had his friendly rival lived, English River Scenery, engraved by Charles Turner and published in 1825-26 by W.B. Cook, is a production of high art, worthy to be a companion to the Liber Studiorum. Turner's earliest knowledge of perspective has been ascribed to a study of Malton's treatise, but it seems more likely that a new occupation which he entered upon about this time, that of supplying skies and foregrounds to the architectural drawings of Porden, an architect then in great practice, afforded him facilities for acquiring a more perfect knowledge of this branch of his art. His labors gave Mr. Porden such unqualified satisfaction that he proposed to the father to receive young Turner as an apprentice without a premium. The prudent old man, however, who appeared from a very early period to have foreseen his son's celebrity, declined the flattering offer. Having furnished Mr. Porden with a liberal stock of skies for future use, the young artist now launched forth as a teacher of watercolor painting in schools and private families, and was so successful that he soon increased his charges from 5 to 10 shillings a lesson. As his reputation advanced, he began to be employed by some of the principal publishers to make drawings for book illustrations, among others by Mr. Harrison of Paternoster Row and the proprietors of the Oxford Almanac. He was also patronized by several noblemen and gentlemen, and having received numerous commissions for topographical drawings in various parts of the country, seldom passed a season without making excursions among the most picturesque localities of England and Wales. In 1789, Turner obtained admission as a student at the Royal Academy, with evidently a more thorough knowledge of the higher principles of art than any other student of that institution, and by this time he began to feel his way pretty securely in his profession. Although at low prices he was fully occupied, and what with teaching, print coloring, and sky manufacturing, must have realized an income considerably beyond the necessities of his position. In 1790, he exhibited for the first time in the Royal Academy a view of Lambeth Palace. This drawing, which is still in existence, has been described as an imitation of Girton, but Turner had by this time gone to a higher school of art and had profited too well by the study of nature to render it necessary for him to borrow from one who was inferior to him in genius. From the list of his exhibited pictures in 1795, when he was only 20 years old, it would appear that he had visited during the preceding year Oxford, Peterborough, Lincoln, Shrewsbury, and Wrexham. From that of 1796, that he had been to Ely, Llandaff, and the Isle of Wight. From that of 1798, his contributions for 1797 having been founded on the labors of 1796, that he had made the tour of Yorkshire, sketching several of its monastic remains and penetrating into Westmoreland, Cumberland, and Northumberland, of Fountains, Kirkstall, and Rievaulx Abbeys, and Temple Newsam. He has made from time to time many drawings, some of which in the possession of Walter Fawkes, Esquire, of Farnley Hall, are among his best works. He loved to represent a dilapidated castle or abbey, with the sun streaming through its Gothic windows, and so extensive had been his rambles throughout England, Scotland, and Wales, that in the after period of his life there was scarcely a scene of grandeur or interest of which he had not some pictorial recollection. He did not, however, condescend to be very exact in his portraits of the places he professed to represent. But if you were unable to discover the objects familiar to your memory exactly where you expected to find them, the tout ensemble represented a more vivid impression of the scene than could have been derived from a mere servile transcript. It was his seashores, even at this early period, that afforded the clearest promise of his subsequent achievements, the more especially if they happened to represent a somewhat tempestuous condition of sea and sky. Nothing could be more highly poetical than most of his scenes of this description. The amenity of Claude has a very soothing and delightful effect upon the mind. What's Claude? The amenity of Claude has a very soothing and delightful effect upon the mind, but the grandeur of Turner, Claude's another painter, but the grandeur of Turner in the wilder creations of his genius leaves an impression which excites deep and lasting reflection. After laboring assiduously as an academy student for 5 years in his father's house, and for 5 years more in an adjoining house in Hand Court, during which period he exhibited no fewer than 59 pictures, he was elected in 1800 an associate of the Royal Academy at the age of 25. He now took a house at number 75 Norton Street, Fitzroy Square, whence he removed in 3 years to the more fashionable neighborhood of Harley Street, number 64. Although the greater part of his early drawings were more or less topographical, several were of a character which had never before been approached by a youth of his age, and evinced an acquaintance with serial perspective which intuitive genius alone could have enabled him to acquire. It was not, however, until he had succeeded to the honors of the Academy that he appeared to be thoroughly conscious of the affluence of his power. Some amateurs who are in possession of drawings of this stage of his career assert that it was the soundest, meaning we presume the most careful period of his art, but it is generally admitted that his very early works bear no comparison with those of the middle and later eras of his art. In 1802, he was elected to the full honors of the Royal Academy, his competitors among associates being so inferior to him as to render it impossible he should be overlooked. It was in the practice of candidates for academical honors to exercise whatever private and personal influence they could command for the purpose of securing a preference over their competitors. Turner, although the inheritor of no aristocratical pride, had too much independence of spirit to follow this course, and however desirous he might be of a position which confers such important privileges on an artist, he resolutely declined to tout for a diploma, and even refused, after it had been conferred, to comply with the ordinary custom of calling upon his supporters to thank them. On being assured by the timid and kind-hearted Stothard that such a concession would be looked for at his hands, he bluffly replied that he would do nothing of the kind. If they had not been satisfied with his pictures, they would not have elected him. Why then should he thank them? Why thank a man for performing a simple duty? Up to this time, he was chiefly known as a painter on watercolors, in watercolors. But the applause which several of his oil pictures had obtained decided him on devoting his chief attention to the more durable medium, and his paintings of ships bearing up for anchorage, fishermen upon a lee shore in stormy weather, and Kilchurn Castle with the Cruachan, well, whatever the Welsh word that is, the Kilchurn Castle with the something or other, added very materially to his reputation and fully confirmed the judgment which had raised him to the higher honors of the Academy. It was in the latter part of 1802 that he took his first continental trip on a sketching tour through France and Switzerland, and accordingly, among his contributions to the exhibition of 1803, we find, besides two views of Bonneville in Savoie, the inauguration scene of the village of Masson, Calais Pier, the English packet arriving, the valley of Août, and the glacier and source of the Aveyron. In 1804, he exhibited only 3 pictures, one of them the well-known Narcissus and Echo, now at Petworth, and a sea piece. In 1805, he was absent from England on the Rhine and in Switzerland, and exhibited nothing. And in 1806, the only memorial of his tour which applied to that year's exhibition was the Falls of the Rhine at Schaffhausen. It had been for several years past his practice to insert in his landscape compositions some scene of classical mythology by way of dignifying it with a sounding name. But with the fear of Mr. Ruskin vividly before us, we cannot admit that the character of the picture was ever much improved by the odd-looking figures in the foreground, which he introduced on such occasions. Nothing could exceed in beauty the poetry of his landscape, but the sentiment of a noble composition was often disturbed by groups added for the mere purpose of helping him to a name for the picture. Sometimes, however, as in his picture of the country blacksmith disputing with a butcher about the price charged for shoeing a pony, the figures are entirely subservient to some powerful effect connected with them, and then they are intelligible enough. Without a blacksmith, we could not, of course, have had his forge, and without his forge there would have been no excuse for that powerful effect which he was so well skilled to produce. The Athenaeum has an interesting anecdote relating to this picture, which we will quote. Quote, in 1807, Turner exhibited 2 pictures evidently with a view to display his command over effects: the sun rising through vapor, fishermen cleaning and selling fish, and, more extraordinary still, a country blacksmith disputing on the price of iron and the price charged to the butcher for shoeing his pony. 2 pictures which killed every picture within the range of their effects. Oddly enough, a modest picture was injured by being hung between these 2 fires. No. Oddly enough, a modest picture thus injured by being hung between these two fires was The Blind Fiddler, the second exhibited picture of Wilkie, then a lad raw from Scotland, contriving to exist without getting into debt on 18 shillings a week. Turner, it is said, on the varnishing day set apart for the privileged body to which he belonged, reddened his sun and blew the bellows of his art on his blacksmith's forge, to put the Scotchman's nose out of joint, who had gained so much reputation by his village politicians. The story is told, without naming Turner, in Alan Cunningham's Life of Wilkie, and it is condemned as an untruth by the reviewer of the Life in the Quarterly Review. But there is no doubt of the correctness of the story, and that Wilkie remembered the circumstance with some acerbity, although he never resented it openly, as we can ourselves undertake to say. When The Forge was sold at Lord Tankerville's sale, Wilkie was in Italy, and Collins, the painter, is describing the sale to him in a manuscript letter now before us, adds, "And there was your old enemy, The Forge." On the other hand, we are assured, as a proof that Turner was incapable of acting so ungenerously, that on one occasion he positively impaired the effect of a favorite landscape for the purpose of avoiding an interference with a portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence. But if, as the Athenaeum justly remarks, Sir Thomas, in the full blaze of his reputation, was sensitive on such a subject, what must have been the feelings of a poor Scotch youth who was striving to obtain a reputation on which his future subsistence depended? If there be any real foundation for the story, its probability is by no means diminished by the fact that Turner was a more forbearing to the powerful and courtly president of the Royal Academy than the great dispenser of art and patronage than to a poor and unfriended man of genius struggling for the very means of existence. Had Turner persisted in outflaring Sir Thomas, the bland but caustic president would have found abundant opportunities of resenting the inquiry. So long as an exclusive body of painters confine to themselves the privilege of heightening the color of their pictures after they are hung up, to the disparagement of those of less favored aspirants, which may happen to be near them, the outsider has little chance of exhibiting his art with advantage. It is to this practice, and the freedom with which the elect avail themselves of it, that we owe the fact that the great room of the Royal Academy is often more like the window of a chemist's shop than a picture gallery. It demanded, however, no malice prepense on the part of Mr. Turner to overpower the effect of the pictures which might happen to be placed in juxtaposition with his own, for his extravagant application of orange chrome was calculated to kill, as painters have it, everything around. It was one of the oft-repeated jests of the late Mr. Chauntry to affect to be warming his hands before the hottest of Mr. Turner's pictures, and on one occasion he carried his badinage so far as to ask him, in the presence of several members of their body, whether it was true that he had a commission to paint a picture for the Sunfire office. Turner had, however, no great ground of complaint, as he had himself shortly before enacted the practical joke of standing beneath an open umbrella before one of Constable's rain-charged landscapes. The sarcasm was, therefore, little more than the conversion of his own joke. In selecting fancy subjects for his early pictures, Thomson appears to have been Turner's favorite poet, although that period, God, this thing is long, Although at that period, as well as on a later date, he selected many of his subjects from Milton. Only a few years ago, indeed, he illustrated a new edition of our great English epic, but his groups from Paradise and Pandemonium do not seem to have been much improved. For many of his finest pictures, however, he selected mottos for the Academy Catalogue from an unpublished poem of his own entitled The Fallacies of Hope. And never was a fallacy more conspicuous than his notion that he was likely to pass for a poet. And never was a fallacy more conspicuous than his notion that he was likely to pass for a poet. It has been the weakness of many great geniuses to be careless of the fame they have legitimately earned and to grasp at laurels to which they have not the shadow of a claim. More crazy crambo than the samples he has given us from year to year of his opus magnum, it is difficult to conceive. The fallacy of hope would seem to have furnished the staple of his inspiration for nearly 40 years. Whatever the subject of his picture, Hannibal passing the Alps, the Val d'Aoste, Caligula's palace, the vision of Medea, the Golden Bough, a slave ship, a funeral at sea, an exile in rock limpet, the opening of the Valhalla, Venice, the Deluge, Aeneas and Dido, its title was usually followed by a quotation from the Fallacies of Hope. Nay, he even painted a very beautiful picture, The Fountain of Fallacy, for the purpose of giving his fallacies a local habitation and a name, yet we now learn that no such poem ever existed. From 1790, besides a great number of pictures, not fewer probably than 100, painted for private collections, many of which have never been exhibited at all in London, and a very large number of drawings, upwards of 1,500, executed for various publishers, Mr. Turner exhibited in the Royal Academy and British Institution nearly 263 pictures and drawings. The greater portion of all these have increased in value with each succeeding year and are now worth 8 or 10 times the price originally placed upon them by the painter. To furnish a catalogue raisonné of even the most striking of these works in the space to which this sketch is restricted is impossible. Many of the painter's more important pictures have been engraved in a style worthy of their excellence by Pye, Goodall, Wallace, Wilmore, Miller, Charles Turner, Cousins, and other of our most eminent landscape engravers. The larger plates from his works, however, albeit of unrivaled beauty as works of art, have realized comparatively little profit to their publishers. The series of views in England and Wales, published in conjunction with Mr. Charles Heath, yielded so Flemish a balance of profit as to compel the publishers to discontinue the work. His picturesque views of the southern coast, published by Arch and Company of Cornhill, The Rivers of England, published by W.B. Cook, and the plates from his Cologne and Dover were hardly more successful, whilst Whitaker's History of Richmondshire, containing 20 engravings from some of the finest of his designs, entailed a heavy loss for its proprietors. All these works, however, are now sought for with the greatest avidity, and fetch, when the impressions are really good, prices greatly beyond their original value. As for the Liber Studiorum, a series of 71 engravings in mezzotint, commenced by Mr. Turner in 1807 and continued at intervals during the 11 succeeding years, undertaken, it is said, in emulation of Claude's Liber Veritatis, and executed 11 of them entirely under his own special superintendence, nay, by himself, although designed to illustrate the great principles of his art and selected from his best subjects, was not successful in the business sense of the term. But the price that a fine and perfect copy will fetch at the present time would seem almost fabulous. Engraved by Lucas, Charles Turner, and others at a cost varying from 5 to 7 guineas only per plate. Proof impressions of single plates have recently sold for upwards of £10, and proofs touched on by himself for more than double, whilst a complete copy of the book, in a very ordinary state, has been lately sold by auction for upwards of 70 guineas, and a very fine set of picked proofs privately for £500. Besides the various series of engravings already enumerated, we must not omit the provincial scenery and antiquities of Scotland, of which the letterpress was written by Sir Walter Scott, illustrations of Lord Byron's and Sir Walter Scott's works. Turner had 30 guineas for each subject, besides 50 proofs. Moore's Epicurean, Campbell's Poems, and Rogers' Italy and Poems.